justice and the appeal. The Trump administration recently announced a new rule for the Fair Housing Act that could seriously impair the Department of Housing and Urban Development's ability to affirmatively advance housing equality. Our guests today are Illinois' 4th Congressional District Representative Chuy Garcia, who has focused on fair housing since joining Congress, Debbie Goldberg, the Vice President for Housing Policy with the National Fair Housing Alliance, and Ajmal Qureshi, Senior Counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So, a little bit of background. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 and includes a requirement that housing and urban development affirmatively act to reduce housing inequality. The AFFH provision of the Fair Housing Act is aimed at ensuring that HUD uses its programs, the funding it provides to cities and counties and states and public housing authorities, to end systemic discrimination, dismantle segregation, and ensure that all neighborhoods have access to community resources that their residents need to survive and thrive and live a full life in their home. In other words, the agency has to proactively work with the recipients of federal housing grants, including landlords and financial institutions, to reduce housing discrimination. So for a long time after that act was passed, there were no federal rules on how the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development should enforce the affirmatively furthering fair housing legal requirement. That meant there was no practical way to implement the requirement. So after 50 years of this legislation being enacted, the Fair Housing Act was passed. So 50 years after the Fair Housing Act was passed, the Obama administration issued a rule in 2015, basically saying that the secretary should initiate a community-centered process that incorporated local data on housing discrimination in order to analyze neighborhood-level problems. The Trump administration suspended that rule in 2018 and has just now put out a new rule. President Trump is tying the rule to his re-election efforts by saying these rules are designed to, in his words, stop low-income housing from being built in suburban neighborhoods in order to protect the, and this is a quote, suburban lifestyle dream. Tactics to prevent targeted groups like low-income families or Black people from moving into wealthier neighborhoods have existed for generations in this country. The practice was first known as redlining. Black families were denied loans to live in wealthier neighborhoods, and wealth-generating projects adjacent to Black neighborhoods were also rejected. The Fair Housing Act itself abolished redlining in 1968, but the programs created by the Fair Housing Act were designed to enable private sector companies like banks and real estate developers to create affordable housing, even though it's less profitable. Today, banks and real estate developers are using federal programs to target Black and brown people with exploitative terms on necessary short-term financial services like lending, thus preventing wealth creation in the Black community. So these banks and real estate developers are given money by the federal government to construct new housing that actually entrenches racial inequalities, making billions in profit. But there's no way for housing and urban development to enforce the Fair Housing Act's requirement that new construction reduce housing inequality, even if there is data showing discrimination. The Obama administration's rule on affirmatively furthering fair housing would have worked to mitigate that trend, but the new Trump rule effectively ends the affirmative requirement. So now that you're all up to speed, I'd like to turn to our guests to talk with us about what's happening in this vein. Beginning with you, Representative Garcia, thank you so much for joining us. So let's begin with a question. This regulation was put through 5 years ago in the second term of the Obama administration, even though the Fair Housing Act became law back in 1968. So how is it that the Fair Housing Act had no rules or guidelines to enforce this provision for nearly half a century? Why was the Obama administration's rule a target for the Trump administration now? And what could this Trump rule do to the Fair Housing Act? Oh, you're muted. You gotta hit the mute button. There you go.
There we go. Thank you. It's great to join you. Let me just say, discrimination and segregation in housing have always been the norm in our country. For too long, Black and brown communities like mine in Chicago have been stuck in unsafe housing with little access to jobs and few opportunities to build financial stability. We've struggled in our neighborhoods and federal level to make progress against the deep historical legacy of slavery and racism. This is a part of that legacy. But the Trump administration has fought harder than any administration in decades to preserve segregation and discrimination. HUD's new rule undermines our country's fight against discrimination and segregation in housing. You've covered a little bit of the background already, but Congress passed the Fair Housing Act in '68 as a response to the uprisings across the country during the civil rights movement. I was 12 or 13 years old, saw a lot of that uprising in Chicago. It requires every federal housing agency, the act does, to not only follow anti-discrimination laws, but to actively fight discrimination and segregation. And last week, HUD issued a new rule called Preserving Community and Housing Choice that completely undermines the intent of the Fair Housing Act. And I used to work as a housing counselor for neighborhood housing services in Chicago, so I know. I also knew Gail Sincata, who helped bring about the Community Reinvestment Act. So the rule is part of the administration's bigger attack on fair housing. In May, the administration issued a rule that guts the Community Reinvestment Act, another crucial law in fighting redlining and discrimination. And of course, last week, Trump made it clear that his administration seeks to keep America segregated. And what did he do? After HUD issued the rule, he tweeted, "I'm happy to inform you, all of the people living in their suburban lifestyle dream, that you will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood." Trump's tweet explicitly affirms that his administration's policy is about continuing segregation and discrimination in housing. Very blatant. Of course, the president is no stranger to housing discrimination, as in 1973, the Justice Department sued him and his father for racial discrimination in their housing business in New York. I've spent my career fighting for fair housing, and I'm proud to keep doing it in Congress, since Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in this country. So this fight is personal for me. One of my proudest moments as a Cook County commissioner before going to Congress was passing a law to prohibit discrimination against Section 8 tenants for their source of income, protecting single moms, protecting veterans, people with disabilities for whom it was legal to discriminate against in Cook County. I also worked with local organizers for many years to pass the Just Housing Amendment to ensure that housing providers do not discriminate against people with criminal records as well. The law finally passed last April after I was elected to Congress. And now I'm working with my colleagues to undo the damage of the Trump administration. The Congressional Review Act allows Congress to overturn rules by federal agencies. And in June, the House voted to overturn the Trump administration's rule on the Community Reinvestment Act. As long as this administration keeps fighting for segregation and discrimination in our neighborhoods, Congress will keep fighting it, because communities like mine need more affordable housing. They need a safe home with clean drinking water. They need access to transit, and they need tenant protections. They need housing justice. Glad to join this conversation.
I want to follow up on that. Yes, I want to talk with you about what's being done to address this rule, because all of the damages you just cited that could stem from a rule like this and all of the sort of discrimination that's implicit in the statements surrounding it lead to that question. What needs to happen to ensure that the affirmative requirement to generate more equitable housing actually is enforceable? And what's the worst fallout you think we could see on what timeline?
Well, since the rule is going to go into effect in a matter of days, I think we're looking at the Congressional Review Act, as we did, to overturn the action that they took on the Community Reinvestment Act. These are important tools that make it possible for people of all races and creeds and nationalities to be able to access housing. We need more housing, especially in the crisis that we're in, for families. We need multi-unit housing to be built. We need housing for the homeless as well. This is an election ploy, especially 90 days from election day. And the president is appealing to the worst instincts in people, thinking that he can turn the suburbs against his opponent in the election. It's most unfortunate and a huge setback for fair housing in our country.
Thank you for that. I want to turn to you, Debbie. First of all, thank you for joining us. You're a part of the National Fair Housing Alliance, which has been working on fair housing issues for years and years and years. What kind of impact did you see back, when the Obama administration passed their rule? What kind of impact did you see on housing organizations, and what are organizations doing now on the ground in order to respond to the Trump rule change?
Well, first I want to say thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation and for focusing on this issue here today. I want to just take one step back and just note, so that everybody's clear, that the concept that's at the heart of this provision of the Fair Housing Act is the idea that where you live matters, right? As Congressman Garcia was saying, right? It determines where your kids go to school, whether you have access to a store that sells healthy groceries, whether you have access to public transportation, whether you can, breathe clean air and drink clean water, what kind of jobs you have access to. So many things about your life are determined by where you live. And yet in our country, because of our history of segregation and kind of deep-seated discrimination that's kind of baked into our housing market, there are tremendous differences in the access to those kinds of resources in different neighborhoods. And it's very much tied to segregation. And one of the I think, real benefits of the rule that the Obama administration adopted in 2015, really a twofold benefit. One was that it really gave jurisdictions who get all of this money from HUD that should be used in ways to promote fair housing, it gave them the tools that they needed to really take a hard look at segregation and disparities in access to opportunities within their communities, and to figure out what needs to change to create a more equitable distribution of resources, so that we have prosperity that's shared for everyone, which makes for a stronger community, stronger economically, stronger socially, stronger in terms of physical health, I think, as we're seeing right now. And it put the voices of the community at the center of that process. It gave people who live with these problems every day a seat at the table to tell their elected officials and the local government what they think the biggest problems are, what the way to tackle them is, and then to hold them accountable for actually taking steps, that affirmative, part of the statute, right? For actually taking steps to make changes in the community that create a better life for everyone. So one of the real harms that's caused by the elimination of that rule and the adoption of this new one is that it has taken away from local governments the tools that they need, including a lot of data, actually, that the HUD had put together for jurisdictions to have at hand, and a mapping tool that let them see how different patterns played out across the neighborhoods in their community. That's all gone. The tool and the roadmap for actually charting change and a path for change, that's taken away. And the opportunity for the community to sit at the table with their local officials and say, what are the problems we need to tackle? How are we going to tackle them? When are we going to get it done by? How are we going to use our resources? That has been taken away as well. And, at this particular moment in time, when I think we are, as a country as a whole, much more conscious of the racial inequities that we live with every day, right? That we must address. And at a time when we're in the middle of a pandemic, where communities of color in particular are being hardest hit because of the conditions in their neighborhoods, it's very difficult to understand why the administration would make this move now, because it can only be harmful to all of our communities.
Well, shying away from harm is a topic we can have a whole other conversation on, shying away versus absolutely magnifying. Ajmal, I'd like to turn to you on this topic. So you were lead counsel for the NAACP on the 2018 lawsuits challenging the Trump administration's suspension of the Obama administration rule. Can you talk to us about sort of the pattern that we're seeing here? How is this new rule part of a larger effort by HUD to turn away from fighting segregation?
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to my colleagues for being on the call today, especially in the midst of all that's going on in the world right now. I think a lot of us are aware of, obviously, when the president acts, we know when the president acts, and we understand what the president is doing, or at least in terms of what he's trying to do. Similarly, when Congress acts, we understand that they're, passing a bill, and likewise, the Supreme Court has gotten additional attention as well as of late in terms of the important role that they play. But what we're talking about today is about the work of agencies. And I think agencies are often called the fourth branch of the government. They might be the most unrecognized and misunderstood part of the government. They're officially a part of the executive branch, but they play such a vital role when it comes to civil rights protections, because oftentimes they set standards. For example, they set standards related to how much chemicals can be in water. They set standards related to what types of background checks employers can do, what their hiring guidelines can be. And in this case, they set standards with regards to the obligation of localities to work to fight segregation. And I think oftentimes, when we talk about civil rights work, we think of Congress, or we think of the Supreme Court, or we think of civil rights lawyers like my colleagues on the line today, but we don't think about the role of agencies, and they really are so important. And I think that's why when you have an administration like this one that comes into office that is hostile to civil rights, oftentimes a lot of the bad work that they seek to do in terms of restricting civil rights protections, when they can't do it through Congress or they're unable to do it through executive order, they try to achieve those results through agency action because they're officially a part of the executive branch. And that's exactly what we've seen from the Trump administration. What we've seen with this new AFFH rule, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing rule that came out a couple of weeks ago, is the latest in a long series of acts, a pattern by the Trump administration to restrict individuals and localities from doing anything to fight segregation. This is part of a larger effort to keep victims of discrimination, to keep victims of segregation from doing anything to confront our nation's generations-long history of segregation and doing anything to combat it. There really has been a three-part series of efforts by the Trump administration. First, in 2017, the Trump administration suspended what was called the Small Area Fair Market Rule, which it would have increased the value of housing vouchers for individuals seeking to move into more high opportunity neighborhoods. And the strange thing about that was that the suspension, the rule itself was a cost neutral rule. It wouldn't have costed the government anything more, yet the Trump administration suspended it anyway. LDF, along with a number of other organizations, sued, and we successfully were able to fight back the suspension. In 2019, the Trump administration offered a new proposed rule which would change what's known as the disparate impact standard. That allows individuals who are victims of policies or practices that harm one group more than another to challenge that policy and practice if another policy or practice is available that would have less of a discriminatory effect. It seems like common sense. If there's a policy or practice that's harming one group more than another, and there's an alternative available that would do less harm, that would meet whatever interest is behind that policy or practice, a defendant or a municipality or a corporation should take that less discriminatory alternative. Yet the Trump administration has sought to eviscerate that rule as well. And now, just a couple of weeks ago, we have this new AFFH rule, which really isn't much of a fair housing rule at all whatsoever. It essentially says that as long as a locality receiving millions of dollars of HUD funding says that it's going to do something that's in some way related to furthering fair housing, that's good enough. No proof is required. No evidence is required that it works. No requirements are required that it addresses the most problematic problems in that particular community. And this is so dangerous. This pattern is so dangerous because, as Debbie mentioned, we're at a time when the nation's eyes are on the impact of racial inequities. And the impact of racial inequities isn't limited to just policing alone, but the racial discrimination and the structural inequity we see in our society is a product of a multitude of forces in not only policing, but also education and also housing. Thank you again.
Yeah, I want to talk with you all about that. And these next few questions are for everybody. So fingers on mute buttons, anyone can jump in. Feel free to surprise me. But I want to talk about the sort of expansive ripples of inequity that we're seeing. A report from the Urban Institute showed that COVID-19 is increasing the housing divide by race and income. As we all know, COVID-19, as you mentioned, has hit Black and Brown communities much, much harder. And the Urban Institute also provided public comment responding to this specific Trump administration rule, saying that it ignores evidence on the structural racism in housing markets and housing segregation that exists today. And as we can see, that has impacts on education, on jobs, on health, on the availability of fresh food and transportation and everything you've described, and even on public safety, which is intimately related to all the other factors I just laid out. So here's a question. In what ways, beyond what we've just talked about, does this new rule make things worse? And is the new rule worse than if no rules were issued at all? Don't be shy, just jump in. I can call on people if I need to.
Let me take the first cut. As has been pointed out, why the rule is so hurtful to efforts by localities to combat discrimination is it removes a framework that they have and data that they have to fight discrimination and to be able to build housing that is accessible to all, that it is affordable to all, that is safe to all. When you remove that framework, you're removing any sense of accountability for the local government. You're disarming them. You're taking an important instrument away that enables local governments to fight that type of discrimination. And lastly, I would say, this isn't just about getting rid of a rule that certain people find onerous. This is about just deregulating the industry and letting the market go where it will. And we know that we needed the Fair Housing Act. We welcomed the rule in 2015 during the Obama administration because it got more specific and it enabled data to help us craft policies to ensure that housing was accessible to all. Finally, it's a real crass, bomb-throwing, desperate action on the part of the president, just less than 3 months away from an election. So without a doubt, those are the motivations for this, and it's bad in every sense of the word. It's bad for families that need multi-bedroom housing, families that need safe housing, and it gets rid of tools that help us advance equity, especially in all the learning that we're doing during the pandemic about disparities and how people are being affected by the pandemic.
I actually want to add another layer for the next person to jump in based on what you just said, Representative Garcia, and thank you for that. I also still can't believe we're 90 days out from the election. I think I speak for everyone when I say that we no longer have any sense of time. But I wanted to add the sort of long-term wealth impact into this equation as you all respond. As you all know, historically, as Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has described, Black and Brown homeowners have had to pay thousands of dollars more for substandard housing in what's been referred to as a race tax. And Black families' median wealth has suffered because of it. It's about 1/10 on average that of white families' median wealth. Black home ownership is around 40%, roughly the same as what it was in the late 60s and early 70s. We've made no gains on increasing home ownership among Black families. So I just wanted to add the factor of long-term familial wealth acquisition into your minds as you talk about the continuing spiral of impact. And I know, Debbie, you've had your mute button off for quite some time. So I want to make sure I call on you.
Thank you. So I think, you make a very good point. And I want to just kind of piggyback on what Congressman Garcia was saying. one of the real problems with this rule that will go live in about a month is that it gives the appearance of enforcing, and implementing this provision of the Fair Housing Act, when it actually would enable, as I read it, it would enable a jurisdiction that wasn't interested in promoting greater equity, which I think many are, and many will be struggling to figure out how to do that in the absence of this rule that they had before. But it would enable a jurisdiction, or allow a jurisdiction, to build all of its new affordable housing in very poor, very segregated neighborhoods, to cut those neighborhoods off from access to transportation, to put facilities that produce pollution in or right next to those neighborhoods, or build a road right next to it or whatever, and pollute the air, and a whole range of things like that. But if they did some minimal code enforcement, they would be deemed to be affirmatively furthering fair housing. And in the early days of the Fair Housing Act, one of the things that many jurisdictions, lacking any guidance from HUD, used to do as a way to say they were affirmatively furthering fair housing was to have a poster contest. During April, which is Fair Housing Month, they would hold a poster contest to promote fair housing. And, they would have school kids create posters and give a prize for the one that's the best, which, is a good way perhaps of increasing awareness of fair housing among school kids, but does not move the needle in any practical way, right? Does not address the issues that you're raising of how do we support and sustain home ownership among Black and Brown families who have been cut out of access to that for so long, and which is the system by which people in this country build wealth, right? That gives you stability and lets you pass along wealth to the next generation. How do we make sure that banks and other lenders are serving those borrowers and those communities fairly and effectively, and a whole range of other things that jurisdictions can do to promote better access and better equity in communities of color. So it lets jurisdictions actually take steps that could be harmful, but gives them a fig leaf to hide behind to say that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing. And it takes HUD out of any effective oversight and enforcement, which we depend on because there is no private right of action under this part of the Fair Housing Act. So
Debbie, can you
none of
explain
us,
for our viewers what that means? There is no
that
private
means
right of action.
no individual can bring a lawsuit against a jurisdiction for failing to affirmatively further fair housing under the Act. There's a lot of other parts of the Fair Housing Act that you can bring a lawsuit under. This one you cannot. So we really depend on HUD to be, on the job here, making sure that jurisdictions are living up to their obligations.
I just want to clarify what we're talking about, because I think people have become really familiar with the accountability question in the policing context, right? The conversation around police right now is all about, in many ways, about qualified immunity and the lack of accountability that lets people act with impunity and really harm the folks they're supposed to protect. And it sounds to me like you're talking about the same thing in the context of people depending on the government to protect them against unfair housing that prevents them from taking part in a safe and fair housing system, and they have no right of action. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, so I'm not a lawyer up front, right? Maybe
Ajmel
might want to weigh in on this
one.
one. The concept is the same, right? That we depend on these governmental systems. And in this case, we depend on HUD to make sure that our cities, our counties, our states are treating us all fairly, right? And using federal and other resources in ways that create equity, that make access to prosperity shared across the entire community. And here, HUD has thrown in the towel and said, it's just not going to do that anymore.
So looking back for a second at redlining and thinking about the president's comments on the suburban lifestyle dream, can anyone explain to me how and if that comment is any different from redlining? Ajmel, we haven't heard from you in a minute. I don't know if you want to take that one.
I'll say a couple things. I mean, I think, many of the viewers may have heard of Richard Rothstein and his writings on segregation and the history of segregation. I think the initial idea behind the creation of the suburbs was the creation of these enclaves for white Americans to move away from integrated communities. So it essentially harkens back to exactly the main idea as to why suburbs were created in the first place. In addition to that, I just want to sort of hit on one thing really quickly. I think the way that the president has framed the 2015 rule as the Obama rule, as if this is a clash between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. The reality is, couldn't be further from the truth. HUD itself, for decades, not only HUD, but GAO as well, the Government Accountability Office, have both issued reports that this is a provision of the Fair Housing Act that has not been enforced. There are reports dating back to the 1990s, extending through 2009, 2010, 2013, and then finally when the rule was issued in 2015. And so it's well accepted that this is a requirement for decades that has not been enforced. And what this new rule does, it not only eviscerates the 2015 rule, but it also rips away the 1990s rule that was in place before that, and essentially comes up with the weakest possible standard that could ever exist. But the good thing is, and I think it's always important to talk about what's next and what we can do about things, as opposed to just complaining about problems, is that, as I talked about at the beginning, this is an agency rule, and there will be other administrations after this. And so I think the onus is on individuals who come into charge at HUD to actually come up with a new rule, go back to the process that actually worked as opposed to this one.
How long would that take? So let's say that Joe Biden gets elected in November, and this is going to be our closing question, because I know that we're a little close on time here. I'd love each of you to comment on what restoration looks like. How could Joe Biden fix this? How can our listeners take action today? Like, what should people be doing and looking for from their elected officials in terms of remedying this? Representative Garcia, your mute button is on.
Thank you, Emily. It is my hope that under a new administration, within a month of the new administration being sworn in, that Congress would act as we did in June, as it relates to the new rule on the Community Reinvestment Act. Congress can undo these rules by the power that it has. And I, for one, will be ready to act on this issue, as well as many other issues that have done similarly on matters pertaining to the environment, other civil rights matters that this administration has sought to roll back. I think there are a host of important topics that need to be addressed by Congress quickly with a new administration. So I don't want people to think that there's doom and gloom. Just like we learned about redlining, and we saw how communities of color were ravaged during the foreclosure crisis of the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, and thereafter. This rule has the potential for exacerbating the type of inequities that we are learning and hearing so much about during the pandemic. So we'll be ready to act as the legislative branch of the federal government.
Thank you so much for that closing thought. And thank you to all of our guests today for joining us. This has been an incredibly informative and interesting episode. Thanks to our viewers. Please tune in tomorrow, 2 p.m. We will be back. This has been The Briefing, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal, and I'm Emily Galvin Almanza.